In December of 1812, the shattered remnant of the greatest army the world had ever assembled staggered out of the snows of Russia. Of the more than 500,000 men who had marched east that summer, only a frozen fraction came home. For years Napoleon Bonaparte had been the master of Europe, unbeaten on any battlefield, a man whose very name seemed to win battles before they were fought. But now the spell was broken, and every court on the continent had seen it. One by one, over more than a decade, he had faced the great powers and beaten them each in turn. Now, at last, his enemies were about to learn the single lesson that could undo him. This is the story of how all of Europe rose together against a wounded giant, how the man who had conquered a continent lost it all, not once but twice, and how, in the very moment of his fall, he became a legend that would outlive him. Welcome back to History with Rohrman. This is Episode 5, the final chapter of our series, Napoleon Rise and Fall. In our last episode, we watched the tide turn. The blockade that was meant to strangle Britain instead turned Europe against him. Spain became an open wound that would not heal, and the invasion of Russia destroyed the greatest army ever assembled, undone not in a single great battle but by distance, hunger, and the cold. Today we reach the end of the road. We will watch all of Europe unite against him at last, the colossal battle of the nations at Leipzig, the invasion of France in one final flash of genius, the fall of Paris and exile to a toy kingdom, and then the most astonishing gamble in modern history, 100 days that ended on a muddy field called Waterloo. This is the fall and the legend. Let us begin. The catastrophe in Russia did not just cost Napoleon an army. It broke the fear that had frozen his enemies in place. For the first time in years, the great powers of Europe began to move together. Prussia, which had suffered years of humiliation and occupation, rose first, its people burning for a war of liberation. Russia, victorious and vengeful, pushed westward. Britain, as always, paid the bills and ruled the seas. Sweden joined, and after months of hesitation, the greatest prize of all, Austria, threw in its lot against him, even though its own emperor was now Napoleon's father-in-law. This was the Sixth Coalition, and it was the widest alliance yet raised against him. But numbers alone had never been enough to beat Napoleon. Something else had changed. This time, his enemies had finally learned how to fight him. The lesson was painfully simple, and it had taken them 15 years and 100,000 dead to learn it. Do not fight Napoleon himself. In the summer of 1813, the Allied commanders met and agreed on what became known as the Trachenberg Plan. Wherever the emperor appeared in person, they would fall back and refuse battle. But wherever one of his marshals commanded alone, they would attack in force and crush him. Napoleon was still the finest soldier in Europe, and in the campaign of 1813 he proved it, winning victory after victory whenever he took the field himself. But he could only be in one place at a time. All around him, his marshals, good men but not geniuses, were being beaten one after another. The coalition was bleeding his army to death at the edges while carefully avoiding the one blow he still knew how to strike. It was the perfect answer to his genius: patience, coordination, and numbers. By October of 1813, the two sides converged on the Saxon city of Leipzig for the reckoning. What followed was the largest battle Europe would see until the First World War, more than a century later. For 3 days, from the 16th to the 19th of October, over 500,000 men from a dozen nations tore at each other around the city. It became known, fittingly, as the Battle of the Nations. Napoleon, badly outnumbered, fought brilliantly on the defensive, but the coalition kept feeding fresh armies into the fight from every direction. More men than he could ever hope to match. In the middle of the battle, some of his own German allies changed sides and turned their guns on the French. Slowly, inexorably, the vast weight of Europe closed in around him. On the third day, with his army crumbling and his ammunition running out, Napoleon ordered a retreat westward across a single bridge over the river. And then came disaster. A nervous engineer blew the bridge too early, while thousands of French soldiers were still on the far side. Trapped, they were killed or captured in droves. Leipzig was a shattering defeat. It cost Napoleon tens of thousands of men and his entire position in Germany. His grand empire east of the Rhine simply collapsed. The German states he had ruled or bullied for years now rose against him or melted away. He fell back toward France with the remnants of his army, and for the first time in the whole long war, the fighting was about to cross onto French soil itself. By the first days of 1814, the unthinkable was happening. The armies of the coalition poured across the Rhine and into France from every direction, converging on Paris. Napoleon could now field only a fraction of their numbers, and many of his soldiers were raw teenage conscripts, boys barely old enough to carry a musket. France was exhausted, bled white by more than 20 years of war, and much of the country simply wanted it to end. By every rational measure, the situation was hopeless. And yet, cornered at last on his own soil, defending his own capital, Napoleon suddenly became again the young general who had electrified the world 2 decades before. What followed in February of 1814 is remembered as the 6 Days Campaign, and soldiers have studied it ever since as a masterpiece. Moving with dazzling speed and striking with perfect timing, Napoleon threw himself at the separate coalition armies closing on Paris and beat them one after another in a lightning series of battles, inflicting far heavier losses than he took. For a brief, brilliant moment, the old magic was back. But it was genius poured into an empty cup. For every soldier Napoleon lost, the coalition could replace 10. His victories were real, and they were spectacular, and they changed nothing. The tide was simply too great. He could win battle after battle and still, day by day, lose the war. The end came quickly. Realizing they could not beat the emperor in the field, the coalition commanders made a cold, clever decision. They would ignore him, leaving Napoleon maneuvering brilliantly in the countryside. The main Allied armies simply marched straight for Paris and its exhausted defenders. On the 31st of March, 1814, the capital surrendered, and the armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria marched in triumph through the streets of Paris, something no foreign enemy had done in 400 years. Napoleon, still full of fight, wanted to march on the city and retake it. But his own marshals had finally had enough. They refused to go on. The war was over, and they told him so to his face. On the 6th of April, 1814, in the palace of Fontainebleau, Napoleon Bonaparte signed his abdication and gave up the throne of France. The man who had ruled from Madrid to Moscow was allowed to keep the empty title of emperor and given a new realm to rule, the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, a speck of land off the coast of Italy. It was meant as mercy and as mockery. The master of a continent was now the sovereign of a rock, a few thousand islanders, and a toy court. In May of 1814, he arrived on Elba to begin his exile. While back in France, the brother of the king the revolution had beheaded, Louis XVIII, was placed on the throne, and the old royal house of Bourbon returned as if the last 25 years had never happened. With Napoleon safely caged, the victors gathered to put the world back together. In the autumn of 1814, the great powers convened the Congress of Vienna, a glittering assembly of kings, princes, and diplomats presided over by the shrewd Austrian minister Metternich. Their goal was to erase the Napoleonic age, to redraw the map of Europe, and restore the balance of power so that no single nation and no single man could ever again dominate the continent as Napoleon had. They carved up territories, restored old dynasties, and built a careful equilibrium designed to keep the peace for generations. On paper, the clock had been turned back. The old order was restored, the borders redrawn, the revolution undone. But the men dancing in Vienna were about to receive the shock of their lives. On the island of Elba, Napoleon was watching and waiting. News reached him that the restored Bourbon king was already deeply unpopular, that the French army missed its emperor, and that the powers at Vienna were quarreling among themselves over the spoils. He saw one last opening, and he took the greatest gamble of his life. In late February of 1815, he slipped away from Elba with a few hundred loyal men, evaded the British ships watching the coast, and on the 1st of March 1815, he landed on the shore of southern France. With a handful of soldiers, the exiled emperor set out to reconquer an entire country. What happened next reads like a legend, and yet it is entirely true. The Bourbon king sent troops south to arrest the adventurer and end the madness. Near Grenoble, the road was blocked by a regiment of royal soldiers, muskets leveled, ordered to fire. Napoleon walked out alone in front of their guns, opened his gray greatcoat to bare his chest, and called out to them, "If there is one among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." For a heartbeat, nothing. And then the soldiers broke ranks, threw down their weapons, and rushed to him crying, "Long live the emperor." It happened again and again as he marched north. Even Marshal Ney, who had promised the king he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, took one look at his old commander and went over to him with his entire force. Louis XVIII fled Paris in the night, and on the 20th of March 1815, without firing a single shot, Napoleon walked back into his capital and was carried up the palace steps on the shoulders of a delirious crowd. It was the most extraordinary comeback in the history of Europe. But the powers at Vienna did not panic, and they did not negotiate. The moment they heard he was back, they set aside their quarrels, declared Napoleon an outlaw and an enemy of the peace of the world, and began marching every soldier they had toward France. This was the Seventh Coalition, and its logic was ruthless and simple. There would be no more one-on-one duels, no more brilliant campaigns to be won by maneuver. They would gather overwhelming force from every corner of Europe and crush him once and for all. Napoleon knew his only hope was to strike first, to smash the nearest Allied armies before the full weight of the continent could gather against him. Two armies stood in his path to the north in what is now Belgium, a British-led force under his old Spanish enemy, the Duke of Wellington, and a Prussian army under the tough old Marshal Blücher. He would march north and try to destroy them one at a time before they could join hands. The armies met on the 18th of June, 1815, near a Belgian village called Waterloo. It would become one of the most famous days in all of military history. Napoleon threw his army against Wellington's line, which held a low ridge across the muddy fields. Hour after hour the French attacked, and hour after hour the British and their allies held, their infantry forming squares to throw back wave upon wave of French cavalry, bending but never quite breaking. Wellington, grim and steady, had one desperate hope, that he could hold his ground long enough for the Prussians to arrive. For Napoleon had beaten Blücher 2 days earlier and believed him knocked out of the fight. He was wrong. Through the long afternoon, the Prussians came. Blücher, beaten but unbroken, had promised Wellington he would come, and he kept his word, driving his exhausted men through the mud to fall upon the French right flank. Now Napoleon was caught between two armies. With the light beginning to fade and his last chance slipping away, he gambled everything on one final throw, sending forward the Imperial Guard, the elite veterans who had never been beaten, the very heart and soul of his army. Up the slope they marched into the smoke, and for a moment the whole battle seemed to hang in the balance. And then, met by a wall of fire, the impossible happened. The Guard wavered, the Guard halted, and the Guard fell back. A cry of horror went up across the French army. The Guard recoils, and in that instant the spell shattered for the last time. The retreat became a rout. By nightfall, Napoleon's army was destroyed and streaming from the field, and Waterloo was lost. There was nothing left. He raced back to Paris, but the will to fight for him was gone. On the 22nd of June, 1815, just 4 days after Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. The 100 days were over. This time, his enemies would take no chances. There would be no toy island a short sail from France. Surrendering himself to the British, Napoleon was placed aboard a warship and carried off to the most remote prison they could find, the tiny volcanic island of Saint Helena, a lonely rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from anywhere. From this place, there would be no return. And there, at the very end, he was alone. His young empress, Marie-Louise, had gone home to Austria when the empire fell, taking their little son, the boy Napoleon had crowned King of Rome, with her. She would never see her husband again. The child who had been born to inherit an empire stretching across Europe would be raised in Vienna as an Austrian prince, and would die young, never having ruled anything at all. The dynasty that Napoleon had divorced Josephine and remade the whole of Europe to secure was gone almost before it had begun. On his rock in the ocean, the master of a continent was left alone with his memories. For nearly 6 years Napoleon lived out his exile on Saint Helena, guarded, watched, and slowly worn down by the damp and the isolation and the pettiness of his jailers. But he was not idle. Knowing that the war of armies was lost forever, he set out to win a different war, the war for how he would be remembered. Day after day he dictated his memoirs to the loyal few who had followed him into exile, carefully shaping the story of his life, casting himself not as a conqueror but as a son of the revolution, a champion of liberty and equality brought down by the jealous old kings of Europe. On the 5th of May, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died on Saint Helena, far from France, at the age of 51. His enemies must have believed that, at last, the story was finally over. They could not have been more wrong, for in death, Napoleon began to win. The lonely, dignified exile, the fallen giant chained to a rock by frightened kings, was a far more powerful figure than any living emperor could ever have been. Across France and across Europe, the memory of his glory swelled into legend, and the small, dull men who had replaced him only made that legend shine brighter by comparison. In 1840, 19 years after his death, a French king bowed to the sheer power of that legend and brought Napoleon's body home. His remains were carried up the river and through the streets of Paris before immense, weeping crowds, in a great national homecoming remembered as the return of the ashes, and laid to rest in a magnificent tomb in the heart of the city, where he lies to this day. The kings had won the war, but Napoleon had won the memory. So let us take stock, as we always do, one final time. The story of this last chapter is the story of the one lesson his enemies took a generation to learn. For 15 years, the crowned heads of Europe had faced Napoleon one at a time, and one at a time he had beaten them, because his genius could always find and destroy a single foe. What finally broke him was not a greater general. It was unity. When his enemies at last stopped fighting him one by one, when they coordinated their armies, refused the battles he wanted, and brought the sheer weight of a whole continent to bear all at once, then patience and numbers slowly ground down the genius that no single army could match. The giant was not outfought. He was surrounded, and yet the men who beat him could not truly put the world back the way it had been. At Vienna they redrew the borders and restored the old kings, and on the map it looked as though the age of revolution had been quietly erased. But the ideas that Napoleon had carried across Europe on the points of his bayonets could not be redrawn or restored away. Equality before the law, careers open to talent, the end of feudal privilege, the clear written legal code, the very notion that a nation belonged to its people and not to a king, all of these had taken deep root in the soil of Europe, and no Congress of diplomats could pull them out. The old order was restored. The old world was not. Within a single generation, the nationalism and the hunger for freedom that Napoleon had awakened would shake every throne that the Congress of Vienna had so carefully rebuilt. And so our journey comes to its end. Over 5 episodes we have followed one of the most extraordinary lives in all of history. We began with an obscure, poor young officer from a small island, an outsider with a foreign accent and a burning ambition. We watched him rise on the chaos of the revolution to become a general whose victories made him a legend, then seize power and place a crown upon his own head, master of a continent, unbeaten and seemingly unstoppable. We saw the tide turn, in the silent ports of the blockade, the harsh mountains of Spain, and the endless snows of Russia. And we have watched the fall, the wounded giant brought down at last by a Europe united against him, only to rise again from the ashes as something his enemies could never defeat, a legend. He was all at once, a tyrant and a liberator, a destroyer and a builder, a man who drenched Europe in blood and a man who remade its laws. History has never quite made up its mind about Napoleon Bonaparte, and perhaps that is exactly why, 2 centuries later, we are still telling his story. Thank you for coming with me on this journey, all the way from the young lieutenant to the legend of Saint Helena. This has been the final chapter of Napoleon, Rise and Fall. But history itself is far from finished, and where we travel next is up to you. There are countless other stories still waiting to be told, other empires, other revolutions, other extraordinary lives in every corner of the past. So tell me in the comments, where should history take us next? I read every suggestion, and the next great story we explore together might just be the one that you name. Until then, thank you for watching. I'm truly glad you were here for the whole ride, and I will see you on our next journey into history.